Hello, 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 and welcome to Romancing the Bard with just a hint of tragicomedy. As you might recall, Shakespeare is known as the Bard, the sort of standard of poetry and poems, especially in Western civilization, because he was considered to be the one who has mastered the sonneteer form as well as the playwriting form. And he is the ultimate bard. So there's that. And we're going to get into a different genre of Shakespeare's plays and of Elizabethan Jacobean drama. And it's romances. And it's romance in a different way than we think of rom-com, but there are some elements that still persist in our rom-coms. It's different from when we think about romance novels with all of the steamy, sexy time. That's also, there are some hints of it, but it's different. We're going back to the medieval way of looking at romance and what the true genre actually means and how it sort of metamorphosed over time. But the thing with Shakespeare's romances that also make it really difficult for editors to categorize or organize Shakespeare's plays is that they aren't just straight up romance, they also have a hint of tragic comedy. They have tragedy elements and they have comedic elements. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today to help give us a clearer insight into the plays that are listed as romances that we might be reading in our classes and in this class. So, on to the next. So, during Shakespeare's time, when a playhouse wanted to advertise the type of play being performed, the promoters, so to speak, flew a flag. And if you are familiar, London proper is on one area, and across the Thames is where all the rest of the sort of entertainment was. And for the strict religious Puritans or Catholics at the time, it depended on which king or queen was ruling as to which religion was sort of at the forefront. Playgoing, bear baiting, tavern dwelling was not necessarily considered upstanding behavior or activities to engage in. So much like the saying goes, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, what happens across the Thames stays across the Thames. And depending upon how wealthy or unwealthy you were, you would either cross over the bridge on foot or you would be able to be ferried across. But one thing is that the flags that were flying above the theaters could be seen across the Thames, so you would already have an idea as to what sort of plays were being performed. So it's sort of like looking up which film you want to see and what you're in the mood for. So a white flag signified that a comedy would be performed, and that means that it's light subject matter. The black flag signified that a tragedy would be performed, which is dark, heavy subject matter associated with death. And then a red flag signified that a history would be performed, which is red symbolizing the subject matter associated with blood, because most of the histories dealt with wars and there would be blood. So that's how we would know that. So Northrop Frye is a renowned literary critic, and he wrote The Anatomy of Criticism in 1957. And in that work, a quintessential work, he describes how all narratives fall into one or four mythos. And what he's calling a mythos is what we're calling sort of a genre: romance, tragedy, irony and satire, which is a little different, and comedy. And the way that he sees it is that there are 6 phases. Each mythos has 6 phases. And when I write sharing is caring, what I mean by that is that each mythos shares 3 phases with the preceding mythos and 3 phases with the succeeding mythos. So when you look at summer, you'll see that summer has a couple of different so in addition to the genres, as you can see here, we've also got the seasons. And the seasons we've talked about in class as paralleling the human lifespan. We have spring, birth, renewal, summer. That's our, many of you would be considered to be in your summer. That burgeoning vitality, a lot of fun, a lot of activity. And then you have your autumn, which technically I don't feel like I'm in my autumn, but the world tells me I'm in my autumn. And that's when you're getting a little bit closer to what people like to call midlife, or older. And it's interesting that it's linked to tragedy, which I don't agree with personally, but I understand why it's there. And then winter is a time of hibernation, a time that leads to death, right? Interesting that irony and satire are connected here. And then it moves over to comedy. So when we look at summer and romance, we can see that when over here it shares some elements with tragedy. And then down here we can see that it shares some characteristics with comedy. And so you've got the complete innocence, youthful innocence of inexperience, and then completion of an ideal. And that's sort of coming from all of these 3 areas. Then you've got happy society resists change, reflective and idyllic view, and then society ceases to exist beyond contemplation. So these are what the different 6 phases are, and then you can sort of look at this to see how things go where. So 1 through 3 overlap with tragedy, 1, 2, and 3 here, and then 4 through 6 overlap with comedy. And then you can see that romance shares in some of them, right? And so does autumn. So what is romance? It's a hybrid because it contains elements of comedy and tragedy. It's marked by extraordinarily persistent nostalgia, like you're thinking back to another time, looking back. In other words, it's a search for glory days, a search of some kind of imaginative golden age in time and space. And we can think about different people that we might know who, rather than living in the present or trying to make every era in their life glory days, might reflect backward and try to reimagine or reinvent some suspected or considered glory days from the past. Virtue, and it contains virtuous heroes and beautiful heroines who represent ideals. And ideals are the paramount, the ultimate, an ideal way of behaving, of living, of loving, of existing. And then there are romances contain villains who threaten the heroes or the heroines' ascendancy. So try to thwart their efforts or keep them from achieving whatever the main goal is. So for a few characteristics of romance, courtesy of Northrop Frye, we've got idealized romances present an idealized world, the black and white world of our desires, where good things are really good, bad things are really bad, and there's not really an in-between. Think about our fairy tales. You're either 100% evil, 100% good, but it doesn't really show the reality of life in that people are really complex, right? And sometimes we do good things, sometimes we do bad things, but it doesn't mean that we're inherently good or evil because of those things, right? But the romances see things more in that dichotomous way. There's a journey, and the journey involves a hero unequivocally who represents what is thought to be right and virtuous. And some will call this archetype, right? We have archetypes in some of these hero characters, and that doesn't allow for them to be completely human, right? If they have to be the paramount, the ideal view of righteousness and virtuousness. The hero can also show signs of divinity. And conversely, the villain unequivocally represents what is wrong and immoral in a given society. The villain can also show signs of demonic qualities. And then you've got the quest with the sage. You've got who helps the hero. You've got prohibition, a sacrifice. You've got a dragon in many, particularly in the beginnings of the romance genre with medieval literature. There's a treasure of some sort. And then there's sometimes the rescue of what? It's the damsel in distress, right? That trope of having a woman who is unable to take care of herself and needs the assistance of a man. We can see some of the heterosexism in some of these ideas. We can see the strict gender roles in some of these stories and ideas. And we have to remember what Elizabethan England looked like at the time, and what society's expectations were that inform some of the stories. But what's sort of beautiful about that is, as much as that's there, we also have Shakespeare, who is offering often a criticism of some of the failings and limitations of the society in which he found himself. Ultimately, there's epiphany time in any romance, and typically this epiphany is thought of to sort of connect heaven and earth. There's an earthly and a heavenly connection. So there's a transcendence of time and place and space, and also an elevation of spirit. And so often this epiphany can take place at a mountaintop, in a tower, even on an island, in a lighthouse, on a ladder, in a staircase. So think about something that helps get the hero or heroine to that connection, that with some sort of a spiritual connection, higher power sort of thing. We've got the common plot is a basic quest sequence. We've got the struggle, a perilous journey, and minor adventures. With this concept of ritual death, we're thinking of it in terms of a crucial struggle. It's usually a battle in which either the hero or heroine or her or his foe or both must die. And sometimes this is a literal death, and sometimes it's a figurative death. And then there's certainly a recognition, the exaltation of the hero or heroine. And often the hero will disappear after the ritual death and reappear for the final stage, final act in the final part on stage. We've also got different phases of romance that we will move through in a given story. And so we've got complete innocence, the birth of the hero. Then you've got a shift to youthful innocence and of experience. And notice these are 6 phases that Northrop Frye mentioned and that we looked at in the earlier slide, right? The youthful innocence of experience. Typically, it's a pastoral world. We're in nature, where there's a parental guide, some sort of guidance, right? It's idyllic. Then you've got the completion of an idea, the quest to destroy evil and return goodness and fertility to the land. And then you've got a happy society that's resisting change. Innocence is assaulted by experience and survives the assault. And sometimes this is seen as moral allegory or morality plays. And it's interesting that a given society will often want to keep its societal rules and laws in place and uphold them, but art often pushes against them and finds the chinks in the armor and cracks away at elements in a society that don't serve the society or serve everyone in the society. So it's interesting to look at, particularly with Shakespeare's plays, even though the society in the play may be resistant to change and experience that comes from experience, but do we also see that there's an argument perhaps for change? And if so, what might that be? Then we've got a reflective or idyllic view. So we have a knowledgeable contemplation of experience and adventure that is reflective, introspective, and trying to make meaning of experience. And then we have society ceases to exist beyond contemplation. The tale is told to a small group with an entertaining tone, so as to instruct or to guide or to challenge or to change, right? And so we have all these sorts of elements, phases in romance. So let's bring this down to Shakespeare a little bit more. With Shakespeare, we'll have an enveloping conflict. There's war, rebellion, jealousy, treachery, intrigue, that may cover a large time span and break Aristotle's rules of time and setting. The conflict may have even begun a generation or more before the events of the play take place. And ultimately, the conflict is resolved at the end of the play. And this is a part of the comedy element of the romance tragic comedy. This is something that you'll see happening in the comedies all the time. You'll also have happy endings. There may be an apparent resurrection, sudden conversions, and it might seem a little unrealistic and abrupt, but will have this positive resolution. And this will transpire despite the tragic situations. So ultimately, the endings provide a positive and happy resolution to the potentially tragic situations within the play. And they're either potentially tragic or just straight up tragic. And this is where the tragic part of the tragic comedy part of romance comes into play. Like I mentioned earlier, we sometimes have archetypes. We sometimes have stock characters, but let's see if in Shakespeare, if he doesn't do something more creative with the characters, and if we don't have more rounded characters in his plays. But you'll have extreme characterization, almost exaggerated characters that can translate the story to almost mythic levels with the depth of their virtue, which makes them godlike, or their villainy, which makes them Satan-like. And that's what that exalted virtue and deep villainy refers to. High class, characters are usually of high social class standing. This links it to the tragedies as well. If the mighty can fall, how much more do the lowly need to be mindful, right? And then the settings, similar to most Shakespeare's plays, no matter the genre, they can be rural, pastoral, or they can be in the court, sort of more urban. As urban as they can be in the 15 and 1600s, right? And then typically the love of a virtuous and idealized hero and heroine are at the core of the plays. And then when I say pure and gross, I mean the purity of love is often contrasted with the grosser or lesser aspects. And grosser just means lowly aspects of love. Maybe even lust or untamed desire. And you can see this playing out not only in The Tempest, but also in Cymbeline. The term tragicomedy was employed to designate the particular kind of play developed by Beaumont and Fletcher around 1610. And Fletcher defines tragicomedy, for his audience as a tragicomedy is not so called in respect of mirth and killing, but in respect it lacks deaths, which is enough to make it no tragedy, yet brings some near it, which is enough to make it no comedy, which must be a representation of familiar people with such kind of trouble as no life be questioned, so that a god is as lawful in this tragicomedy as in tragedy, and mean, lower class people as in a comedy. So ultimately, here's just a quotation that describes in more flowery language what I've been talking you through with the characteristics of romance, tragicomedy within romance. You can see, here's the characteristics of a tragicomedy. And I want you to go ahead and look for these things in the romance play that we're discussing in our class, and see what you think about it. Even though at the time of the first folio there was no tragicomedy delineation, many critics consider Shakespeare's final plays to be romantic tragicomedies rather than just romances. In times past, some critics have considered the romances to be experiments, but more scholars see them as something more than just experiments, that they have more depth, more meaning to them. G. Wilson Knight, an English literary critic and academic known for interpretations of the mythic content of literature, wrote an essay titled The Wheel of Fire of Shakespeare's Drama. And Knight lived 1897 to 1985. And Knight views the last plays, these last romances or romantic tragicomedy plays, as allegories of great creating nature, quote, end quote, and, quote, as of myths of immortality, end quote. So I want you to keep that in mind. Do you think that the play we're reading is an allegory of sorts? Is it great creating nature? Is it creating nature? Is it great at doing it? Does it present myths of immortality? And does it become a sort of myth on its own? And if so, what's the lesson? What's the moral that it's trying to teach? Most recent criticism of Shakespeare's romances center on the themes of time, growth, decay, and regeneration. Again, I want you to consider this. How does Shakespeare speak to these themes, these ideas? What are his arguments related to these concepts in his plays? particularly the romances and the romance plays play you're reading for our class. So most classify the following Shakespeare's plays as romances, and you'll see that Cymbeline is an ish, as is The Winter's Tale, but Cymbeline is even more ish than The Winter's Tale because of the tragic comedy, the romantic tragic comedy element, and The Winter's Tale as well. And so when looking at these plays, I want you to think about what might be the more tragic elements, the comedic elements, the romance elements, and why might Shakespeare choose some of these elements to convey his story. And particularly when we're getting to Cymbeline, it takes on very much some of the characteristics of a fairy tale that fairy tales we're familiar with, right? We have a little bit of Snow White in there. You might see some modern examples of modern fairy tales, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And The Winter's Tale also has some otherworldly elements to it, but it takes on more of the Pygmalion idea, which is sort of fascinating. And that's all, folks. Enjoy the Bard. Bardmancy sans the tragedy. Because we're dealing with, you know me and my puns. I have to throw some wordplay in there. But we're going to have not all the way tragedy, but some romance, tragic comedy. Can't wait to hear your thoughts. And I wish you well.